The gates had fallen. Smoke curled into the sky, a black banner above a city that no longer lived. The Mongols moved through the ruins with the precision of men harvesting a field, only this was no harvest of grain. It was a harvest of bodies. Chroniclers like Adamalik Javani and Rashid al-Din tell us that when the Mongols conquered a city, the pattern rarely changed. First came the slaughter of men. The sword did not discriminate, soldier, merchant, scholar, even child, all cut down to ensure no resistance remained. But when the killing ended, another phase began. One far more intimate. The survivors, mostly women, were gathered like spoils of war. Some were divided among the soldiers, others set aside for commanders, and the most beautiful or highborn taken directly into the Khan's household. In the secret history of the Mongols, the closest thing to a Mongol voice we possess, women are described plainly as booty, listed alongside horses, camels, and gold. The text does not soften its words. Women were part of the plunder. Consider the fall of Nishapur in 1221. After the massacre, the city was left in silence, yet from the silence came the cries of women, rounded up for distribution. Noble wives, daughters of scholars, widows of warriors, all herded like livestock. Some became concubines, others slaves, others vanished into the camps of men who had just murdered their families. The wives and daughters of nobles were especially targeted, their status transformed overnight from symbols of prestige to tokens of humiliation. This was not new to Genghis Khan. Long before he carved an empire, he knew the terror of losing women to enemy hands. The secret history recalls how his own mother, Holun, was seized by raiders and forced into marriage. Years later, the same fate struck his young wife Borte, kidnapped by the Merkits. These wounds ran deep. When Genghis rose to power, he made certain the humiliation he once suffered would become a weapon he wielded against his enemies. What had once been taken from him, he would take 1,000-fold. So when a city fell, the pattern was clear. Javani describes the Mongols selecting women with methodical care, the young, the fertile, the noble. To seize an enemy's wife or daughter was more than lust, it was domination written onto the body. A defeated ruler stripped not only of land and crown, but of family itself. His bloodline diluted, his legacy twisted into the lineage of his conqueror. On the fate of the Khwarezmian royal family, after their empire was broken, their women were absorbed into the Mongol elite. Marriages were forced, concubinage imposed. These unions were trophies, reminders that resistance meant not just death, but the permanent erasure of one's line. The Mongols themselves, when they list the spoils of campaigns, they do not separate women from cattle or goods. They are tallied the same way, property claimed by right of conquest. The words are blunt, but their meaning devastating. To be captured was to be possessed. Imagine standing in those streets after the fires had died. The men of your family gone, their bodies rotting under blackened walls. And then, the sound of boots, of orders shouted in a foreign tongue. You and your sisters lined up, evaluated like trade goods. Some marched away to the tents of soldiers. Some reserved for men whose names you did not know. And if you were noble, you might be sent far from home, forced into the very bloodline that had destroyed your people. This was the true shadow of Mongol victory. Not just the ashes of cities, but the breaking of women. The chronicles repeated again and again, as if to hammer home the lesson, conquest was not only about land, or treasure, or power. It was about bodies, about women made into weapons, wombs turned into trophies. The Mongols carried their empire forward not only with swords, but with the captives who bore the next generation of their dominion. And it all began here, in the aftermath of victory, when the fires still smoldered and the conquerors turned their gaze upon the defeated women, prizes of empire, bound into history's darkest legacy. Before Genghis Khan became the terror of empires, he was a boy on the steppes, and the world he grew up in was already shaped by the taking of women. Among the nomadic tribes of Mongolia, warfare was not only about cattle, horses, or pasture. Women themselves were prizes of victory. When one tribe fell to another, the conquerors carried off their women as wives, concubines, or slaves. To seize a rival's daughter was to erase his line and claim his legacy. Even Genghis Khan's family was forged in this cycle of abduction. His mother, Holun, had been kidnapped from her first husband by Yasugei, Genghis Khan's father. Yasugei intercepted her on the road and carried her away. She became the mother of Temujin, the boy who would one day be Genghis Khan. From his very birth, the lesson was clear: women were not safe in a world of rival tribes, and their fate was written in the strength of men's swords. The same wound cut even deeper when Temujin grew to manhood. His young wife, Borte, was stolen from him by the Merkit tribe. Temujin gathered allies, including his blood brother Jamuka and his father's old companion Togrul, to rescue her. When she returned, she bore a son whose paternity was uncertain, a scar that would follow Genghis Khan throughout his life. That memory never left him. The pain of losing a wife, of seeing his own bloodline nearly corrupted by enemies, became a fire that burned into his later conquests. So when Genghis Khan rose to power, the old traditions of the steppe became weapons of empire. What had once been tribal custom, he elevated to a system of domination. Defeated men were killed or enslaved. Their wives and daughters were seized, not at random, but carefully selected. The noble women of conquered cities were reserved for the Mongol elite. The daughters of rulers, generals, and wealthy merchants were forced into the tents of Mongol commanders. Take Nishapur, Urgench, or Samarkand. Rivers of blood after these cities fell, yet amid the carnage, a different kind of spoils was gathered. Wives and daughters of the defeated elite were set aside. The highest born, the most beautiful, were sent to the households of Genghis Khan and his sons. For the Mongols, women were not only prizes of conquest but tools of statecraft. To take an enemy's wife was to humiliate him forever. To father children by her was to write the bloodline of the conquered into the legacy of the conqueror. This was the origin of the practice that would haunt generations. It began not with the fall of cities, but with the lessons Genghis Khan absorbed as a child, lessons written in the abduction of his mother, the loss of his wife, and the brutal traditions of the steppe. When he built an empire, he carried those scars with him, transforming ancient custom into a weapon of terror. When the Mongols stormed into the great cities of the Islamic world, the devastation was remembered in fire and blood. But the Persian historians who witnessed those years also record another layer of horror: what happened to the women left behind. Abd-al-Malik Juvayni, a governor under the Mongols who wrote the history of the world conqueror, described the aftermath of conquest with chilling precision. After the slaughter of men came the gathering of survivors. The women of the city were not spared. They were divided, enslaved, and parceled out like the livestock and treasure looted from the streets. Juvayni writes of entire populations forced into submission, their daughters and wives delivered into the hands of the victors. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din, writing a generation later in his Compendium of Chronicles, confirms the same pattern but adds further detail. For the Mongols, the women of the defeated elite, queens, princesses, noble wives, were reserved for the highest ranks. The humblest soldiers might be given slaves, but the most valuable women were handed to Genghis Khan himself or to his sons and generals. These women were not only taken as concubines, they became symbols of Mongol domination, living proof that no bloodline was beyond the conqueror's reach. The story of the Khwarezmian Empire makes this brutally clear. When Genghis Khan's armies shattered the empire of Shah Muhammad II, the devastation stretched from Persia to Central Asia. Cities like Bokhara, Samarkand, and Urgench fell in succession, each one emptied of life. But amid the ruins, the wives and daughters of the Khwarezmian elite were singled out. Many of these noble women were taken as concubines by the sons of Genghis Khan. What had once been the guarded pride of a dynasty was reduced to the property of the very men who had destroyed it. This was not random chaos, it was deliberate policy. The Mongols were separating women of high status from the common masses. Ordinary women were enslaved in vast numbers, serving in households, dragged into military camps, traded across the empire. But queens and princesses were trophies, reminders that the proudest dynasties of the Islamic world now lay in Mongol hands. Chinese sources tell the same story from another perspective. After the Mongols had established rule in China, registers were kept of captured women. Names, family ties, and beauty were carefully catalogued. This was not the frenzy of soldiers in the heat of victory. It was a bureaucracy of captivity, ensuring that no valuable woman was overlooked, and that the greatest prizes were delivered upwards to the ruling family. Together, after every great victory, Mongol officers stood over the fates of women. Some were destined for slavery, some for concubinage, some for the households of khans. To seize a man's wife or daughter was to erase his honor, to stain his bloodline, and to rewrite his family's destiny into the empire of the steppes. Giovanni, though a servant of the Mongols, could not hide the horror. He described Urgench as a city where the blood of men ran in rivers, while women screamed as they were herded into captivity. Rashid al-Din, writing with the cold detail of a court historian, confirmed what Giovanni suggested, that the taking of women was as much a part of conquest as the burning of cities. And the Chinese Yuan records show how far the system extended, down to registers and ledgers, reducing women to names on a page. The chronicles agree on one truth: the fall of an empire was written not only in broken walls and slaughtered men, but in the stolen lives of women. Their fate was not an accident of war, it was the final act of conquest, the moment when the victors claimed not only land and wealth, but the very flesh of the defeated. When the Mongols seized women in conquest, it was not always for lust or cruelty alone. These women also became weapons of politics, living bonds that tied defeated peoples to their new masters. The secret history of the Mongols, the closest voice we have from Genghis Khan's own time, speaks directly to this practice. Marriages were not simply personal, they were acts of statecraft. When Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan, rose to power, he did not only unite tribes by war. He cemented those victories through women. Daughters of conquered chieftains were taken as wives, their unions sealing the submission of their fathers' clans. What looked like marriage was, in truth, political absorption. This was an old tradition on the steppe. The giving and taking of women had long been a way to forge alliances or humiliate rivals. But under Genghis Khan, it expanded to an imperial scale. After cities fell, the noble women were singled out, princesses, wives of rulers, daughters of governors. These women were sent into the households of the Khan or distributed among his sons. They did not enter as equal brides but as captives. Their marriages carried a message: your dynasty has ended, its blood now belongs to us. Consider the Khwarezmian catastrophe. When Shah Muhammad II's empire was broken, his family scattered, his nobles slaughtered, their women did not simply vanish into slavery. Many were placed into the harems of Genghis Khan's sons. For the Mongols, this was more than indulgence. It was political theater. Every child born of these forced unions was living proof that the Mongols had replaced the old ruling house with their own blood. Chinese records echo the same pattern. The Yuan Shi, the official history of the dynasty founded by Genghis Khan's grandson, preserves notices of captured women entered into marriage registers. Even in the eyes of the bureaucracy, these women were not just concubines, they were part of a deliberate strategy to fuse conquered populations into the Mongol order. To write them into Mongol households was to erase their former loyalties and bind their families, willingly or not, to the empire. This blurring of lines between rape, forced marriage, and politics created a system where women became the currency of empire. Persian historians noted the humiliation it carried. To see a queen or princess, once the pride of her people, now forced to serve the conqueror, was as devastating as the fall of a city's walls. The act crushed morale as effectively as any massacre. And yet, in the cold logic of the Mongol state, these women were also useful administrators of empire. A captured princess might be given as wife to a Mongol prince, her lineage lending legitimacy in the eyes of her former people. A noble widow might be forced into the Khan's household, her presence symbolizing that even the highest women of the land now served the conqueror. The chronicles are clear, this was not chance. It was policy. Genghis Khan and his descendants wielded women as tools of diplomacy just as they wielded swords in battle. Temujin absorbing rival tribes not only by killing their leaders but by marrying their daughters, binding their clans into his growing confederation. Later, as the empire stretched across Persia, Russia, and China, the same pattern repeated. The result was a legacy written not only in conquest but in bloodlines. The wives of rulers, taken against their will, became the mothers of children who would rule in the name of the Mongols. The boundary between humiliation and politics dissolved. What began as a weapon of terror became a cornerstone of statecraft. In the end, the chronicles show us that the Mongols conquered twice. First with fire and sword. Then with forced unions that ensured no dynasty could ever rise again without Mongol blood in its veins. The chronicles do not whisper. They shout. Again and again, after the Mongol massacres, when the streets ran red with blood, women were seized in numbers so vast that entire cities seemed to vanish into captivity. In his History of the World Conqueror, Giovanni describes the aftermath of Nishapur. Once the men were exterminated, he writes, the survivors, overwhelmingly women and children, were carried away. Not dozens. Not hundreds. But thousands. Their names unrecorded, their lives erased, their bodies turned into the spoils of victory. Rashid al-Din, writing with the precision of a court historian, adds his own chilling detail. After the fall of Urgench, so many women were taken that the Mongol camps swelled into temporary cities of captives. Among them were noble wives and daughters destined for the households of commanders, while the rest were divided among soldiers or sold into slavery across the empire. The chronicles make no attempt to soften the truth. This was not the chaos of battle. It was systematic absorption, a practice repeated from Samarkand to Herat, from the Caspian to the gates of China. The numbers alone stagger the imagination. At Merv, 700,000 people were slaughtered. Of those left alive, the majority were women and children, swept up into captivity. The scale of suffering remains beyond measure. Entire populations disappeared into Mongol hands, their women scattered, their bloodlines broken. Modern science has confirmed what the chroniclers already knew. Genetic studies of the so-called star cluster lineage, the CM217Y chromosome, reveal that around 16 million men alive today carry the genetic signature of Genghis Khan or his immediate male descendants. That is not the legacy of natural unions. It is the scar of systematic domination, proof that Mongol men spread their bloodlines with overwhelming force. The chronicles told this story 8 centuries ago. DNA only etched it deeper into the record of human history. Archaeological evidence speaks the same language. Excavations across Central Asia and Persia have uncovered mass graves of women and children, often dating precisely to the Mongol invasions. Many show signs of trauma, malnutrition, and violence. The earth itself testifies to the scale of horror, its silent bones confirming what Giovanni and Rashid al-Din could only describe in ink. Taken together, the chronicles, the graves, the genetic legacy, the picture is undeniable. The Mongols did not merely conquer with armies. They conquered with wombs. They erased dynasties, subjugated peoples, and wrote their victory into the very bodies of women. This was the true weight of Mongol conquest. Not only the destruction of cities, but the capture of generations. Not only fire and sword, but the silent absorption of women into a new empire. A scale of horror so vast that even today, centuries later, the bloodlines of the conquered still carry its mark. The Mongols are long gone. Their empire fractured centuries ago, their khans reduced to names in dusty chronicles. But their shadow remains, not only in ruins scattered across Asia, but in bloodlines that still flow through millions of people alive today. The chroniclers who witnessed their rise warned of this legacy. Adamalik Giovanni, writing in the 13th century, said that entire generations had been silenced by Mongol conquest. Rashid al-Din, serving under the Ilkhanate, described how dynasties were erased and women of noble houses forced into Mongol beds. To the Persians who survived, the Mongols were not just conquerors of cities. They were conquerors of families, of blood, of memory itself. The trauma was immediate. Cities like Nishapur, Merv, and Urgench lost their men in rivers of blood, while women were swept into captivity. For them, the nightmare did not end when the swords were sheathed. It continued in tents, in households, in palaces where their names were forgotten and their bodies repurposed for the empire's design. Each child they bore was a reminder, the conqueror now lived inside their blood. Women are listed as part of the spoils, counted alongside livestock and goods. They were absorbed not as individuals, but as property. For those taken, survival meant carrying forward the very bloodline that had destroyed their homes. Generations remembered this terror. Persian poets wrote verses of mourning for lost daughters, their voices echoing long after the cities were rebuilt. Chinese records catalogued the women given in forced marriages, each name another thread pulled from a broken tapestry. Oral traditions in Central Asia spoke of ancestors stolen, mothers carried off, and children born with identities not entirely their own. The pain endured not just in stories, but in the silence of those who could not speak it. And still, the evidence lives on. Modern genetic studies reveal the so-called Genghis Khan star cluster, a Y-chromosome lineage found in nearly 16 million men today. That number is staggering, but its meaning is darker still. Each carrier of that marker is not just a descendant of empire, he is a descendant of conquest. His very existence speaks to the absorption of women across continents, a biological echo of violence that happened 8 centuries ago. This is the haunting legacy, women's bodies transformed into battlegrounds, their children born into identities shaped by force. For the Mongols, it was victory. For the conquered, it was survival at the cost of memory. Bloodlines became mixed not by choice, but by domination. And those lines still run through the veins of millions today. The chronicles could not have imagined DNA tests or population studies. Yet they already understood the permanence of what had been done. To seize a woman was not just to dishonor her family in the moment. It was to write Mongol power into future generations, to ensure that the conquered would never fully escape their conquerors. Centuries later, that is why the Mongols remain a terror in memory. Not only for their massacres, their burning of cities, or their unmatched cruelty on the battlefield, but because their conquest reached into the most intimate parts of human life, into families, into bloodlines, into the very core of identity. The empire of Genghis Khan has crumbled. The banners are gone, the palaces fallen to dust. But the echo remains. In whispered stories of ancestors taken. In the bones of women buried in mass graves. And in the silent testimony of DNA, carried in living bodies around the world. The Mongols are not just history. They are legacy. A reminder that conquest does not end with fire or with sword. Sometimes, it endures in flesh, in blood, in the children of the conquered, a haunting echo that time itself cannot silence. They tell us history is about kings, battles, and borders. But the chronicles reveal something darker. Behind every empire lies broken families, stolen women, and bloodlines scarred forever. What Genghis Khan did was not buried in the past, it still lives on in the veins of millions today. And yet, most of these stories are never told. They are locked away in forgotten manuscripts, buried under dust, or softened by textbooks too afraid to show the true face of history. Here on Tale of History, we don't look away. We confront the past in all its brutality. Because only by seeing the terror clearly can we understand the world we live in now. So if this story unsettled you, if it left you imagining the cries of women carried away, the silence of cities left in ashes, the haunting echo of bloodlines reshaped by violence, then you already know. These tales are not just history. They are warnings. Subscribe to Tale of History, and do not miss what comes next. Because the stories the past tried to bury, are the ones you need to hear most.